Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is taking the info you share, articles, research notes, and really digging in.
Yeah, pulling out the key insights, the interesting bits, and, well, the stuff you really need to know.
Think of us as helping you navigate, pointing out landmarks, maybe some warnings too. We want you to get up to speed quickly but properly.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you've sent over a stack of sources all about traditional Chinese herbal approaches. It's quite a mix.
It is. We've got scientific reviews, some clinical discussions, traditional perspectives as well.
And the common thread seems to be metabolism, cholesterol, and, overall heart health, a pretty complex area.
Definitely dense. So, our job today, explore what these sources actually report about specific herbs. What are their supposed uses?
And then look at how they're sometimes combined, that whole idea of synergy in traditional formulas.
Right. And finally, pull it all together in an exhaustive summary. And that absolutely includes the critical caveats and warnings that the sources themselves really stress.
Yeah, we need to walk through what's presented, the potential benefits reported, but also the crucial context. Got to have both.
Okay, let's start with the building blocks, the individual herbs mentioned in your sources. Lots of discussion around lipids, cholesterol, inflammation, oxidative stress, all linked back to heart health, right?
Absolutely. First one that jumped out was fenugreek, or, well, an aqueous extract. The source is termed AQETFG.
AQETFG.
Okay.
Please. Yeah.
And studies mentioned in the sources reported it decreased levels of something called lipid peroxide.
Lipid peroxide. That's like a marker for oxidative damage to fats.
Exactly. Damage in the body. And it reportedly increased antioxidant enzymes, things like SOD and COT.
SOD and COT, those are our body's own defense enzymes, right? Helping protect cells.
That's them. So the sources are suggesting effects related to fighting that cellular stress.
Did they get into how it might do that? Any proposed mechanisms?
They did mention a couple of ideas. One was inhibiting lipase activity.
Lipase, the enzyme that breaks down fats we eat.
Correct. So the thinking is it might block some of those enzymes right in the gut, reducing how much dietary fat gets absorbed.
Interesting. Potentially limiting fat uptake from food.
Mm.
What was the other idea?
Well, a component in fenugreek, galactomannan, apparently forms a kind of viscous gel in the intestine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this gel, according to studies cited, could potentially inhibit the absorption of both glucose and lipids. This was linked to improving dyslipidemia, those unhealthy blood fat levels in studies on rats.
Working right at the absorption level. Interesting stuff. What about Syzygium cumini?
This one was highlighted more for its antioxidant components, things like polyphenols, flavonoids. You hear those terms a lot.
You do.
And the sources report a potential mechanism against high lipid levels involving inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase.
Hang on. HMG-CoA reductase, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Isn't that the enzyme targeted by statin drugs?
It absolutely is. Good catch. So the sources are pointing towards a potentially similar biological target, though they suggest it's through a different mechanism, reportedly involving flavonoids increasing something called CAMP-dependent phosphokinase, which then inhibits that reductase enzyme.
So potentially hitting the same target, but from a different angle. Fascinating how traditional herbs and modern drugs might sometimes converge like that, according to these reports.
It really makes you think. Okay, moving on to ginger. Zingiber officinale. Most of us know ginger, right? For cooking, maybe motion sickness.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe a nice cup of tea.
True. But beyond those traditional uses, the sources note studies reporting it reduces plasma cholesterol levels.
Okay.
And inhibits the oxidation of LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. And oxidation makes it worse.
Right.
And even in mouse studies, reduce the development of atherosclerosis. That's the hardening of the arteries.
So not just tinkering with numbers, but potentially affecting the disease process itself, at least in those animal models.
That's what was reported. Plus, it's mentioned as potentially having anti-inflammatory and antithrombotic effects. So reducing inflammation and maybe helping prevent blood clots.
Okay. Broader cardiovascular support suggested there.
Ah.
What about star anise, another familiar spice, Illicium verum?
Yeah, the sources mention a specific study on star anise. An ethanolic seed extract apparently showed significant anti-cholesterol potential in vitro.
In vitro. Okay, quick reminder for everyone, what does that mean exactly?
Good point. In vitro just means in glass. So in lab tests, think test tubes, petri dishes, not in a living organism.
Right.
And this study mentioned its potential compared favorably to vitamin C and even simvastatin, but crucially in that specific lab setting.
Got it. So promising lab data may be a starting point for research, but doesn't automatically mean it works the same way inside a person.
Precisely. It's an important distinction. The sources do note star anise is rich in various phytochemicals, alkaloids, steroids, terpenoids, and link these to its reported antioxidant potential.
Okay. How about gomju, chrysanthemum? That sounds very traditional.
It is. Deep roots in Chinese medicine, according to the sources. They specifically mention traditional applications, including treating hyperlipidemia and hypertension.
High cholesterol and high blood pressure.
Right. As well as other traditional uses like clearing liver heat, inner heat, and having reported anti-inflammatory and anti-aging properties.
Interesting mix of traditional concepts and modern terms there. Now, shanza, that's hawthorn fruit, crataegus. This one seems to pop up a lot for heart health in the sources.
It really does. Sources report studies where it decreased cholesterol levels, and it's described as having a whole range of potential properties related to the heart and blood vessels.
Like what?
Well, hyperlipidemic lowering lipids, cardiotonic strengthening heart muscle contraction, antiarrhythmic, potentially helping with irregular heartbeats, hypotensive lowering blood pressure, and antioxidative. It's quite a list.
That's a very broad spectrum of reported effects. But there was a caution note, too, wasn't there?
Yes, two key things mentioned. First, its sour taste might not be great for people with stomach ulcers or, high stomach acidity.
Makes sense.
But more importantly, a potential interaction was noted with the heart medication digoxin.
Digoxin. Why?
Likely because shanza itself is reported to have those cardiotonic heart strengthening effects. So taking both together could potentially cause problems. That's a really crucial interaction risk highlighted.
Absolutely critical to know. Okay, danshen. Salvia miltiorrhiza, another one often discussed for cardiovascular health in these sources.
Correct. Sources mention studies showing it lowering total cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL, the bad stuff, while actually raising HDL, the good cholesterol.
That's the ideal profile change you look for.
It is. It's also noted for inhibiting LDL oxidation. And traditionally, it's discussed for promoting blood flow and being used for conditions like angina pectoris, that's chest pain from reduced blood flow, and even acute MI, heart attack.
So, reported effects on the lipid numbers and on blood flow, central to heart disease. What about gherkin, radix pruraria?
Gherkin is reported to have hypocholesterolemic effects, specifically lowering total cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL. And the sources also say it promotes the excretion of cholesterol and bile acids via the liver.
Basically helping the body get rid of excess cholesterol.
That's the idea. But, and this is a really important but the sources emphasize, it has the potential to induce or inhibit certain CYP enzymes.
CYP enzymes. Remind us what those do.
They're a big family of enzymes, mostly in the liver, that are crucial for processing and breaking down tons of medications, prescription drugs, over-the-counter stuff.
So if an herb messes with those enzymes,
it can seriously change how your body handles other drugs, make them too strong or too weak or last longer or clear out too fast. It's a major pathway for potential drug interactions that needs careful consideration.
That link to medication processing is huge. Okay, next up, ZE, Rhizoma alismatis.
Ziyi is also noted for hyperlipidemic effects, lowering total cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides, increasing HDL, and reportedly increases glucose uptake, too, which is relevant for blood sugar.
Okay. Any other reported effects?
Yes. Beyond lipids, sources mentioned it potentially inducing endothelial progenitor cell angiogenesis.
Whoa. Okay, translate that.
Yeah. Basically, helping new blood vessels grow and repair themselves, and also potentiating neuroprotection against ischemia, potentially helping protect brain tissue from damage if blood flow is cut off.
So, potential benefits mentioned for blood vessels and brain health. But, again, a warning attached.
Yes, a significant one. The sources explicitly caution about potential hepato and nephrotoxicity.
Meaning potential harm to the liver and kidneys.
Exactly. That's a serious potential side effect flagged in the sources.
Definitely something to take seriously. How about Dihuang?
Dihuang is discussed in these sources mainly for glucose metabolism. Sources report it enhancing glucose-stimulated insulin secretion and having hypoglycemic effects, so lowering blood sugar.
Interesting. Do they mention why?
They point to specific compounds in the herb, like tatalpol and its oligosaccharides, as possibly being responsible, and it's mentioned as a component in traditional formulas used for diabetes.
Okay. And Dihuang, rheum officinale, isn't that mainly known for, like, constipation?
Traditionally, yes, for constipation and also inflammation.
Hmm.
But the sources circle back to lipid metabolism here too, mentioning its reported action in promoting cholesterol and bile acid excretion from the liver, similar to what was mentioned for Guizhi.
Helping clear it out. Got it. Huangqi astragalus.
Huang Qi is noted for reportedly increasing HDL levels, the good cholesterol. It's described in the sources as a ketonifying herb, traditionally seen as supporting vital energy, and it shows up in various formulas.
Okay.
Oh, and one source briefly mentioned a study looking at fermented Chinese herbal mixes, including astragalus, and their effects on lipid metabolism in hens.
In hens. Okay, interesting side note. Now let's talk about bupleurum, or chai-hu. This one you flagged earlier comes with a pretty significant warning, according to the sources.
It really does. So chai-hu is traditionally used for things like colds, flu, liver issues. Sources highlight reported hepatoprotective and antioxidant properties, potentially protecting the liver, fighting cell damage, preventing liver fibrosis, inhibiting inflammation.
Sounds potentially beneficial for the liver then.
Hmm.
But the warning.
The crucial warning, stated very clearly in the sources, is about a dose-dependent correlation with liver injury, particularly noted in hepatitis B patients.
Dose-dependent meaning the risk goes up with the amount taken.
Exactly. And they even cited findings suggesting that formulas containing over 19 grams of chai-hu were more likely to induce hepatotoxicity liver damage.
Over 19 grams. That's a specific threshold people should be aware of if they're looking at formulas containing it. Very important detail from the sources.
Extremely. And finally, Lingzi, Denoderma lucidum, many people know it as reishi mushroom.
Right, very popular.
Traditionally used for promoting longevity, lowering heart disease risk, but the sources shared results from a human study on healthy adults.
And what did that find?
Well, it showed maybe a slight trend towards lower lipids and increased antioxidant capacity in urine. But, importantly, the sources state there were no significant changes found in most lipid or other key heart health biomarkers.
Ah, so the human data presented wasn't really conclusive for lipid benefits in that group.
Not in that particular study on healthy adults, no. Though, importantly, they also reported no evidence of toxicity was seen in that group either.
Okay, so we've stepped through what the sources report on a whole range of individual herbs, potential effects on lipids, metabolism-related pathways. But as you said, traditional Chinese medicine isn't usually about single herbs. It's the combinations, right? The formulas.
Exactly. That's a core concept the sources really dive into. This idea of herbal formulas, often structured with like a king herb, then minister, assistant, envoy herb supporting it.
A whole hierarchy in the formula.
Right. And the idea isn't just mixing them together randomly. It's designed, theoretically, to produce synergistic effects.
Synergy, where the combination does something different or maybe stronger than just adding up the individual parts.
That's the concept. And potentially even to modify or lessen the toxicity of some of the individual ingredients.
Okay, so the whole is meant to be greater or perhaps safer than the sum of its parts. Did your sources give specific examples?
They did. One mentioned was Shengmai-sen, or SMS.
SMS. What's in that?
It's ginseng, ophiopogon, and schizandra. And the sources propose a synergy based on the reported actions of each.
How so?
Well, ginseng's key invigorating action linked to antioxidant support. Ophiopogon's yin-nourishing action tied to immune modulation and anti-inflammatory effects from a compound called ruscogenin. And Schizandra's own reported antioxidant and anti-inflammatory actions.
Okay, so different reported actions. How do they supposedly work together in SMS?
The context discussed in the sources is protection against heat stroke-related stress, specifically mentioning cardioprotection and reducing ischemia or perfusion injury.
That's the damage when blood flow returns after being blocked.
Exactly. The sources delve into the proposed biochemical basis for how these combined effects might work together in that stressful situation.
Interesting. What other formulas came up?
Shubifu Ziyu Tang XFZYT.
Catchy name.
According to one source, this is apparently a common prescription for hyperlipidemia in Taiwan and China. And interestingly, it contains several herbs we already talked about individually.
Like which ones?
Danshen, Dehuang, Guigenala, among others.
Ah, so taking some of those individual players and putting them on the same team in a specific way.
Precisely. And the sources report on the effects of XFCYT as a whole formula. Things like reducing total cholesterol and triglycerides, increasing HDL.
The lipid effects again.
Yes, but also inducing that endothelial progenitor cell angiogenesis, helping blood vessel growth, and potentiating neuroprotection, protecting brain tissue.
So the sources use this as an example of how the combined formula is discussed as having these broader effects beyond just the numbers.
Exactly. It demonstrates that principle of formulas potentially targeting multiple pathways simultaneously.
Got it. And then there was Xiaochai Hutang, XCHT. That's the one with bupleurum, the herb with the liver warning we discussed.
Yes, and it's used as an example where the combination reportedly showed potentially enhanced effects compared to just the bupleurum alone.
How so?
One source discussed a study finding XCH2 was actually better than bupleurum by itself at reducing certain liver enzymes, astalt, and lipid peroxidation, at least at specific doses.
So the suggestion is synergy, that the formula potentially offered better liver protection or antioxidant action than the single potentially problematic herb.
That seems to be the implication discussed in that source. It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? An herb with potential issues on its own is part of a formula being studied for a potentially beneficial synergistic effect.
It absolutely does. Any other quick examples of combinations?
Well, the sources briefly mention others, like gongju combined with cassia seeds, though that was noted for eye symptoms. It illustrates the combination strategy. And the general principle of using formulas comes up in discussions of diabetes or endometriosis and other sources you provided. The main takeaway is that the traditional approach, as presented here, really leans heavily on these specific multi-component combinations for their intended synergistic actions.
All right. We've looked at individual herbs reported in the sources. We've seen how the sources discuss these synergistic combinations. Now let's try to pull this all together. Time for that exhaustive summary, making sure we include all the really essential context and those crucial caveats the sources kept bringing up.
Okay, so wrapping up the findings. The picture presented across these sources is that, yes, various traditional Chinese herbs and specific herbal formulas are reported to have potential for influencing lipid levels, cholesterol metabolism, and related things like oxidative stress, inflammation, glucose control.
Which, connects directly back to why someone might be interested in these approaches for conditions like hyperlipidemia or general cardiovascular health. That's the potential upside suggested by some of the findings reported.
However, and this is really where the sources provide absolutely vital perspective, they raise some significant issues that are critical for understanding the full picture and should definitely temper how we interpret those potential benefits.
Okay, let's lay out these crucial caveats. What's the first big one the sources consistently flagged?
Research quality. It came up repeatedly. While there are many studies mentioned, often reporting positive findings, multiple sources explicitly state that the overall methodological quality of much of this research is a significant limitation.
Meaning the studies themselves might have flaws.
Potentially, yeah. They mention specific issues like a lack of detailed information on randomization, how people were assigned to groups, insufficient allocation concealment, basically, preventing researchers from knowing who gets what treatment, and inadequate blinding in many randomized controlled trials.
So even in trials, researchers or participants might have known who was getting the herb versus a placebo, which can introduce bias.
Exactly. And these kinds of methodological weaknesses make it really difficult to say with high confidence that the reported effects are definitely due to the herb or formula, and not just bias, chance, or other factors. Drawing firm conclusions becomes problematic.
Right, the evidence base isn't as robust as you'd want for definitive claims. What's the next challenge raised?
The inherent complexity of studying these things, we touched on it with the formulas.
Because it's not just one chemical.
Not even close. A typical formula has multiple herbs. Each herb has, well, potentially dozens or hundreds of different chemical compounds. The sources note this makes it incredibly difficult to apply the standard drug research model,
which usually focuses on isolating and testing one single active ingredient.
Precisely. With these complex mixtures, it's hard to pinpoint exactly which compound or which combination of compounds is responsible for any observed effect or how they interact. Understanding the specific mechanism is a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's like trying to understand an orchestra by just listening to one instrument versus trying to understand a single soloist. Very different research problem.
Well put. And then beyond the research challenges, the sources raise some very serious safety concerns. This is probably the most critical takeaway from the material you shared.
Safety has to be paramount. What specific safety issues were highlighted?
Okay, several categories. First, drug interactions. We mentioned some specific examples already.
Right, garlic, ginger with blood thinners like warfarin or aspirin.
Yes. ginseng with warfarin, alcohol, MAOIs, shanza potentially interacting with digoxin because of similar heart effects, gadgen affecting those crucial CYP drug metabolizing enzymes.
Which can mess with how lots of other medications work.
Exactly. And kava, though maybe not used for lipids, was mentioned for increasing risks with sedatives, sleeping pills, antipsychotics, and potentially boosting liver damage risk with certain other drugs.
So the message from the sources is clear. If you're taking any other medications, especially for serious conditions like heart issues, blood clotting, mental health, you absolutely need to be aware of these potential interactions and talk to a doctor.
Without question. The sources also flag potential toxicities associated with specific herbs themselves.
Like the Buplorum chai hu liver issue.
Yes, that dose-dependent liver injury risk, especially over 19 grams, and potential hepato and nephrotoxicity liver and kidney damage noted for zeshi. The risks with kava were also stressed again as a major safety concern.
So individual herbs can carry specific risks, according to these sources. But there was an even, well, more alarming safety issue that came up repeatedly.
Yes, and honestly, this is something everyone needs to hear. Adulteration.
Adulteration, meaning?
Meaning illegal products being sold as traditional Chinese medicine, but they've been intentionally spiked secretly with powerful pharmaceutical drugs.
Wait, spiked with actual prescription medications? Like what?
The sources give examples like potent corticosteroids, think dexamethasone antihistamines, painkillers, sometimes even drugs for erectile dysfunction or weight loss, things that give a quick, noticeable effect.
Wow. So someone takes what they think is a natural herb, maybe for joint pain or allergies, and they're unknowingly dosing themselves with a powerful, undeclared synthetic drug.
Exactly. And the sources state this isn't rare. It's described as a recurrent problem identified in safety reports from various countries.
And the danger there is
Well, it's huge, right?
immense.
Yeah.
You're taking a potent drug without knowing it, often at an unknown or inconsistent dose. It could interact dangerously with medications you are supposed to be taking. It can cause serious side effects on its own. It can mask underlying conditions. And it can lead to dependency or withdrawal problems. The sources present this as a major public health risk.
That's incredibly concerning. That kind of intentional deception just destroys trust.
It really does. And the sources point to this as a massive challenge and risk in the field. They also briefly mention other risks, like improper prescription of formulas or incorrect preparation of herbs contributing to potential harm.
Okay. And finally, the sources touched on the regulatory side of things.
Yeah, just noting that often these products are marketed as dietary supplements, particularly in places like the U.S., which means they don't go through the rigorous FDA drug approval process for safety and efficacy. So the burden of proof is different, and the claims they can make are limited. Often you see that disclaimer, these statements have not been evaluated by the FDA.
Right. It's a very different regulatory landscape compared to prescription pharmaceuticals.
Wow. Okay. So, putting it all together, the sources paint this really complex picture. On one hand, you have these traditional practices, thousands of years old in some cases, and some modern studies reporting potential effects on metabolism, cholesterol, heart health markers.
But then immediately the sources slam on the brakes with these significant red flags, serious questions about the quality of much of the research evidence, the sheer difficulty of studying these complex mixtures scientifically.
And then these critical safety warnings. Potential drug interactions, toxicities linked to specific herbs at certain doses, and maybe most disturbingly, this pervasive problem of intentional, dangerous adulteration of products claiming to be traditional remedies.
It's definitely not a simple story. The sources show a rich history and areas that might warrant further careful investigation, but they absolutely underscore the substantial challenges, the real risks involved, and the urgent need for much more rigorous research, better quality control, and just general vigilance.
This has been, well, a really crucial deep dive, pulling out not just the potential reported benefits, but all that essential context and the serious warnings directly from the sources you shared. Thank you for bringing them to us.
No problem. It really puts the information in perspective, doesn't it? Emphasizes the need for incredibly careful and informed consideration if you're looking into this area.
Absolutely. And that leaves us and you with a final thought to mull over, drawing directly from everything these sources presented. Given this long history of traditional use and the hints of potential suggested by some studies, but weighed against the huge challenges in researching complex mixtures effectively, and especially considering the very serious safety warnings about interactions, toxicities, and particularly adulteration, How should any of us navigate the information out there about traditional herbal remedies? And what fundamental steps are truly needed to understand their real role as any safely and effectively in modern health?
Something definitely worth thinking about.